He held her hand as she took her last breath in a quiet home overlooking Lake Zurich. And then, for weeks, he said almost nothing at all. No interviews. No statements beyond a few devastating lines posted to the world. The man who had loved Tina Turner for nearly 4 decades, who had given her one of his own kidneys just to keep her alive a little longer, disappeared from public view entirely. And then, slowly, in fragments, in tributes, in small gestures that spoke louder than any press conference ever could, Erwin Bach began to let the world see what that loss actually looked like. This is the story of the silence and what came after it. Most people who watched Tina Turner spin across a stage in leather and heels, who watched her survive one of the most publicized abusive marriages in music history and rebuild herself from nothing into a global icon, never got to see the second half of her story. They saw the trauma. They saw the triumph. But the quiet 27 years that came after, the ones spent not performing but simply living, loved by one man who never once tried to make her story about himself, remained mostly in shadow. That was by design. Tina Turner spent the first half of her adult life having her identity controlled by someone else. In the second half, she made sure that would never happen again, and the man beside her made sure of it too, by staying almost entirely silent about their life together while she was alive. It's only now, in the aftermath of her death, that fragments of what that devotion actually cost him, and what it meant to him, have started to surface. To understand why his silence mattered so much, and why its ending felt so significant, you have to go back to the beginning of a love story that started in the most unglamorous way possible. An airport pickup. In 1985, Tina Turner had just clawed her way back from bankruptcy, from a marriage that had nearly destroyed her, and from an industry that had quietly written her off as a relic. She was in the middle of the most improbable comeback in music history, riding the success of Private Dancer, when a record label sent a young German music executive to collect her from the airport in Cologne. His name was Erwin Bach. He was younger than her, unassuming, and by his own later description, not remotely trying to impress a global superstar. He was simply doing his job. Tina would later say that something shifted in her the moment she saw him, a feeling she didn't trust at first, because trusting feelings like that had nearly cost her everything once before. They didn't rush into anything. For years, their relationship existed mostly out of the spotlight, a friendship that deepened slowly into something neither of them apparently felt the need to announce to the world. Tina had spent the first part of her life being paraded, controlled, and put on display. Whatever she built with Erwin, she built quietly on her own terms, away from cameras. That instinct to protect the relationship from public consumption would define their entire life together. They were together for 27 years before they married in 2013, in a small, private ceremony at their lakeside estate in Switzerland, the country Tina had by then called home for decades and where she had become a citizen, formally relinquishing her American citizenship. It wasn't a made-for-television wedding. It was intimate, populated by real friends including Oprah Winfrey and Bryan Adams. Rather than paparazzi, a far cry from the spectacle that had once defined her career. By that point, Erwin had become simply the person Tina Turner trusted most in the world. That trust was tested in ways most marriages never face. In 2017, Tina's health took a devastating turn. She was diagnosed with kidney failure, a condition that would have required a lifetime on dialysis, a prospect she has said in her own words she found unbearable. She later revealed that she had reached a point where she genuinely considered ending her life rather than living through the illness the way it was unfolding. What changed the course of that story wasn't a miracle drug. It was Erwin. He offered her one of his own kidneys, underwent the surgery, and gave her years of life she otherwise would not have had. Tina wrote about this moment with a rawness that surprised even longtime fans, describing it not as an act of heroism in the cinematic sense, but as the purest expression of a love that asked for nothing in return. She said it gave her a second life, literally, and that it changed how she understood what devotion could look like when it wasn't tangled up with control or fear, the way love had once been for her. For the remaining years of her life, Erwin largely stayed exactly where he had always been, beside her and out of the spotlight. When Tina Turner passed away on May 24, 2023, at their home in Küsnacht, near Zurich after a long illness, the news broke to the world through a short, aching statement. It confirmed what many feared and what few had been fully prepared for. The queen of rock and roll, a woman who had survived abuse, poverty, industry rejection, and physical collapse to become one of the most influential performers of the 20th century, was gone at 83. In the immediate aftermath, tributes poured in from every corner of the entertainment world. Beyoncé, who had channeled Tina's energy in her own performances, spoke of her influence. Angela Bassett, who had portrayed her on screen in a performance that earned an Academy Award nomination, spoke of her strength. And in the middle of all of it, Erwin Bach, the man who had spent nearly 4 decades loving her, said remarkably little in public. He confirmed her passing. He thanked the world for its support. And then he largely stepped back, choosing to grieve away from the noise, the way the two of them had chosen to live for most of their relationship. That silence stretched on. Weeks became months. While the world continued to process the loss through documentaries, tribute concerts, and the continued success of the Broadway musical that told her life story, Erwin Bach remained almost entirely out of view. Some assumed this meant he was simply a private man uninterested in public grieving. But those closest to the couple understood it differently. Silence for Erwin wasn't absence. It was the same instinct that had defined their entire relationship. The belief that some things are too sacred to explain to strangers. When he did eventually begin to speak, even briefly, about life after Tina, it wasn't through a tell-all interview or a dramatic television appearance. It came in smaller, quieter gestures. He continued to appear, occasionally and without fanfare, at events connected to her legacy, including screenings and commemorations tied to the musical and documentary projects that continued to honor her life. He spoke, when he spoke at all, not about revelations or secrets, but about gratitude. Gratitude for the years they had. Gratitude for a love that had, against every odds stacked against it by her past, turned out to be safe. What makes this story worth telling isn't scandal, because there isn't one. It's the shape of the silence itself, and what it reveals about who Tina Turner became in the second half of her life, and who chose to walk that road with her. For a woman whose early adulthood was defined by a partner who trademarked her own name so she couldn't use it if she left him, who beat her, controlled her finances, and paraded her in public while destroying her in private, the quiet decades she spent with Erwin Bach were not a footnote to her story. They were the proof that her story didn't have to end where the trauma did. Tina Turner spent years after leaving Ike Turner rebuilding not just a career but a sense of self. She has spoken candidly, in her memoirs and interviews across decades, about how deeply that first marriage damaged her ability to trust, how it took years of therapy, spiritual practice, and simple time before she could imagine loving someone without fear attached to it. When Erwin Bach entered her life, she was not looking for another grand romance. She has said she was cautious, guarded, uncertain whether she was even capable of that kind of trust anymore. What eventually convinced her wasn't a grand gesture. It was patience. It was the accumulation over years of a man who never once tried to control her, never once needed her fame to validate himself, and never once made her feel like anything other than exactly who she was. That distinction matters enormously when you understand the full arc of her life. Ike Turner built a version of Tina that he could manage and profit from. He created the stage name, controlled the money, dictated the choreography and the schedule, and ultimately nearly destroyed the woman underneath the persona. Erwin Bach, by contrast, appears to have wanted nothing from Tina Turner the icon. He wanted Anna Mae, the woman underneath decades of performance, trauma, and reinvention. Their relationship, unfolding almost entirely away from cameras for the better part of 3 decades, was in some ways the quietest form of rebellion Tina ever staged. After a lifetime of being watched, she chose, finally, to be loved in private. This is part of why, when she finally agreed to marry him in 2013, after 27 years together, it felt less like a beginning and more like a confirmation of something that had already proven itself many times over. She didn't need the marriage to know the relationship was real. She had already tested it against illness, against the demands of fame, against her own deep-seated fear of losing herself again inside someone else's needs. Their remaining years together were, by most accounts, quiet ones. Tina had already retired from touring in 2009, closing out her performing career with the aptly named Tina 50th anniversary tour before health issues began mounting in the years that followed. She largely stepped back from public life, choosing instead to spend her time at their home overlooking Lake Zurich, cultivating the kind of ordinary, unspectacular peace that had eluded her for most of her adult life. She released a spoken and musical project exploring Buddhist chanting traditions, a spiritual practice she credited with helping her survive her years with Ike Turner and continuing to ground her decades later. In her later years, that same practice became less about survival and more about presence, about simply being grateful for a life she had once feared she might not live to see. When she passed away in 2023, the tributes that followed focused overwhelmingly on her music, her performances, and her cultural impact, and rightfully so. But somewhere in the outpouring of grief, there was also a quieter story unfolding, one that received far less attention. The story of a man who had spent 38 years loving her, and who now had to figure out how to keep living in a world that no longer had her in it. In the months that followed, Erwin Bach's public presence remained minimal, but not non-existent. He has, at various points, spoken briefly about the process of grieving someone whose life had been so publicly documented while their private relationship remained so carefully guarded. He has described the strange experience of watching the world mourn a global icon while he mourned, simultaneously, a wife, a partner, and in many ways the person who had trusted him more completely than she had trusted anyone else in her adult life. That duality is something few people will ever have to navigate, and it's part of why his continued reticence feels understandable rather than mysterious. He has continued to be involved, in a limited and careful way, with projects tied to preserving her legacy, including documentary efforts and the ongoing productions of the Broadway musical that dramatizes her life story. His involvement has never come with the tell-all energy that celebrity media coverage so often expects. Instead, he has approached these appearances the way he approached their entire relationship, as an act of quiet stewardship rather than public performance. He is not interested in being a character in someone else's narrative about Tina Turner. He simply wants her story, and the truth of what she survived and became, to be told accurately. It's worth pausing here to consider what that means in the context of everything Tina survived. She was a woman who spent her childhood abandoned by both parents, raised by strict grandparents who offered structure but little warmth. She was a woman who, as a teenager, found an unexpected outlet for that isolation in a St. Louis nightclub, when she boldly asked to sing with a local band and ended up rebranded, renamed, and eventually trapped in a marriage defined by violence and control for over a decade and a half. She was a woman who left that marriage with nothing but her name, and even that name had been trademarked against her. She rebuilt herself from food stamps and borrowed couches into one of the best-selling live performers in history, becoming, at 44, one of the oldest women to top the charts in an industry obsessed with youth. And after all of that, she found a kind of love that asked nothing of her except to be exactly who she already was. Erwin Bach's decades of near-total public silence about their relationship were, in retrospect, not a withholding. They were a form of respect. He understood, in a way so few people in her orbit ever fully had, that Tina Turner had earned the right to a private life. He gave her that, and when she died, he continued to give it to her, even as the world clamored for details, for statements, for some grand public reckoning with grief that would satisfy an audience's appetite for closure. What he has offered instead, in the sparse and careful comments he has made since her passing, is something smaller but arguably more powerful, an insistence that their love, however extraordinary the circumstances surrounding it, was ultimately very simple. He has spoken of gratitude rather than grandeur. He has emphasized the ordinary textures of their life together, the years spent simply existing side by side in their home by the lake, rather than the dramatic milestones that made headlines. In a life defined by scale, by sold-out stadiums and record-breaking tours and headline-grabbing revelations about abuse and survival, the love story that closed out Tina Turner's life was defined instead by restraint. There is something worth sitting with in that. So much of how we tell stories about survivors focuses on the trauma itself, on cataloging the abuse in detail, on treating the pain as the most interesting part of the narrative. Tina Turner's own willingness to speak publicly about the violence she endured with Ike Turner was genuinely groundbreaking, especially for a black woman in an industry and an era that offered survivors of domestic violence very little cultural permission to be believed, let alone protected. But the second half of her life, the Erwin Bach years, offer a different and equally important kind of story. Not the story of surviving harm, but the story of what becomes possible once safety is finally, actually achieved. That's ultimately what Erwin Bach's long silence, and its gradual, careful lifting, seems to represent. Not a scandal, not a hidden revelation waiting to shock the world, but the quiet insistence of a man who loved a survivor well enough to let her have, finally, a love story that belonged only to her. His unwillingness to trade that privacy for public attention, even after her death, even when doing so might have been the easiest path to sympathy or relevance, says more about the nature of their relationship than any tell-all interview ever could. In the years since Tina Turner's passing, her legacy has only continued to grow. New productions of the musical based on her life have opened in cities around the world, introducing her story to audiences who never saw her perform live. Documentary footage continues to circulate, offering new generations a window into both her staggering talent and the resilience that carried her from a cotton field in Tennessee to sold-out stadiums across the globe. Scholars and cultural critics increasingly cite her as a case study not just in musical reinvention, but in personal autonomy, in what it looks like for a woman, and specifically a black woman, to reclaim her narrative from an industry and a partner who once sought to control every part of it. And somewhere in the middle of all of that continued attention, Erwin Bach remains largely where he has always chosen to be, present but not performing. It would have been easy, in the immediate aftermath of her death, for him to capitalize on the moment, to sit for the kind of exclusive interview that networks and outlets would have paid enormously for. He didn't. He has instead offered the world small, careful glimpses of what their life together actually meant to him, delivered not through spectacle but through consistency. Showing up quietly for the projects that honor her work, speaking briefly and without dramatics when he does speak at all, and otherwise allowing her music, her performances, and her own words to continue telling her story. Perhaps that is the most fitting tribute anyone could offer a woman who spent the first half of her life having her voice controlled by someone else, and the second half reclaiming it entirely. Tina Turner told her own story, on her own terms, in her memoirs, in her interviews, in the raw honesty of songs like What's Love Got to Do With It that channeled personal pain into universal anthems. She did not need Erwin Bach to speak for her, and by all appearances, he understood that better than almost anyone. His restraint, his willingness to let her legacy remain hers, is not the absence of love. It is, in its own quiet way, the fullest expression of it. That is the story behind the silence. Not a scandal withheld, but a devotion protected. And in an industry and a culture that so often mistakes visibility for love, Erwin Bach's decades of quiet loyalty stand as a reminder that some of the deepest commitments are the ones that never needed an audience at all. Tina Turner spent her life teaching the world what survival and reinvention could look like. In his own understated way, Erwin Bach spent his life showing what it looks like to love a survivor without ever asking her to perform that survival for anyone but herself. And if his silence has finally begun to lift, even slightly, in the years since her passing, it hasn't been to reveal some hidden shock. It's simply been to let a little more of the truth breathe. That Tina Turner, after everything she endured, got to spend her final decades genuinely, unconditionally loved. And for a woman who once believed she might never have that truth alone is more than enough to leave the world moved. If this story of quiet devotion, survival, and enduring love touched you, take a moment to like this video and share your thoughts in the comments below, and consider subscribing for more stories that go beyond the headlines.